At 5:22 in the morning on November 9th, 1944, the East Altoona roundhouse was already 3 hours into its first shift. The building was 395 feet in diameter. Its 52 stalls radiated outward from a central turntable like the spokes of an iron wheel. At any given hour during the war years, between 300 and 350 steam locomotives were somewhere in the service cycle that this building managed. Incoming from a run, under inspection, on a pit, receiving coal and water and oil, or heading back out to the departure tracks. The smell was coal smoke, hot metal, cylinder oil, and the persistent sulfur of a firebox not fully cooled. The noise was hammers, air tools, the grunt of a steam crane, and somewhere in the building always the low percussive exhaust of a locomotive being moved by its own power. The Pennsylvania Railroad in 1944 rated more than 4,000 steam locomotives across a system that stretched from New York to Chicago, from the Great Lakes to the Potomac. Keeping those locomotives in daily service was not a secondary operation. It was, in industrial terms, the point. The Altoona Works, the complex of 125 buildings spread across 218 acres at the foot of the Alleghenies, was the center of that effort. Built beginning in 1850 and expanded continuously for the next 8 decades, it had grown to employ 16,500 workers at its peak, hold 4,500 machine tools under 94 overhead cranes across 88 acres of covered shop floor, and produce by 1944 over 6,800 locomotives from its own erecting bays. The locomotives on the tracks of the eastern United States were largely built here. The ones that needed heavy maintenance came back here. And on a cold November morning in the middle of a world war, the roundhouse that kept them moving never stopped. The Pennsylvania Railroad called itself the Standard Railroad of the world. The claim was not modesty. By the early 1940s, the PRR moved more passengers and more freight than any other railroad in the United States, operated on a larger electrified network than any other in the Western Hemisphere, and maintained a locomotive fleet whose sheer size required a supporting industrial organization that most manufacturing companies would have recognized as their primary business. Before we go further, if this kind of story matters to you, consider subscribing to the channel. Every video here is built around the systems that actually hold this country together. The power lines, the rail corridors, the infrastructure that most people never think about until it stops working. If that's the kind of documentation you want to keep watching, the subscribe button is how you tell us. And we want to hear from you. Did you work on a transmission line, a railway, a pipeline, a hydroelectric facility? Did a parent or grandparent spend their career maintaining infrastructure like this, keeping the lights on, keeping the freight moving? Leave it in the comments. These stories belong in this record. Now, back to the system. When a steam locomotive completed a run and entered a division point roundhouse, a defined sequence of work began immediately. The locomotive did not wait. It could not wait. The next crew was already being called, and the next train was already being assembled in the yard. The locomotive was cut from its train and moved by a hostler to a track leading to the turntable. The turntable operator rotated the table to align with the locomotive's designated stall. The hostler drove the locomotive into its stall, and the door closed behind it. The first men on the locomotive were the fire cleaners. They dropped the grate, raked out the accumulated clinker and ash from the firebox, and removed it by ash pan and barrow. An oiler moved beneath the locomotive on a pit, checking every lubrication point. The boilermaker's crew came next, checking the boiler, the flues, the water gauges, and the safety valves. Coal was loaded from an overhead coaling station. Water came from a standpipe or overhead tank. Sand was added to the sandbox. At the East Altoona roundhouse during the wartime peak, this cycle turned over 300 locomotives per day. A single stall might see 3 complete service cycles in a 24-hour period. The roundhouse was not a place locomotives rested. It was a place locomotives were rebuilt for the next 100 miles. The roundhouse handled what could be done between runs. What could not be done between runs went to the Juniata shops. The Juniata locomotive shops, opened in 1891, became the PRR's primary facility for heavy locomotive overhaul. A locomotive arriving for a classified repair would be stripped to its frames. Driving wheels came off and went to the wheel shop. Connecting rods and valve gear went to the machine shop. The boiler was uncoupled from the frame and moved to the boiler shop, where flues were replaced and stay bolts were tested. The machine shop at Juniata, at its wartime peak, held thousands of individual machine tools, lathes, planers, boring mills, milling machines, each operated by a machinist whose specialty was a particular class of components. In 1943, the single peak year of production at Juniata, 111 new steam locomotives were completed, in addition to the steady flow of classified repairs. It was a production line. The product was a repaired locomotive. The cycle time was measured in weeks. At Harrisburg, the character of the PRR's motive power changed. The Pennsylvania Railroad electrified its main line from Philadelphia to Harrisburg in 1938. East of Harrisburg, trains ran behind GG1 electric locomotives. West of Harrisburg, the catenary ended. Harrisburg was the exchange point. The Harrisburg Locomotive Terminal, built in 1937, had a massive 750-ton coal tower, a 180-degree roundhouse, and a turntable that at 125 feet was among the largest on the system. At Harrisburg's terminal, the arriving GG1 was uncoupled from its train. A serviced K4S or T1 was positioned on the adjacent track. If the schedule held, the delay was measured in minutes. The men who performed that exchange knew every locomotive assigned to their terminal by characteristic. The machine was standardized. The knowledge of it was personal. Across the Susquehanna River from Harrisburg, Enola Yard opened in 1905 and grew without interruption for the next 4 decades. By the late 1920s, it covered 316 acres, contained 145 miles of track, and operated 476 switches. At its operational center were the locomotive facilities, a 54-stall roundhouse, 2 turntables, a running repair shop, and a diesel maintenance building added in the late 1940s. Enola, in its peak years, processed 11,000 freight cars per day. The record was 20,661 cars in a single 24-hour period during 1943. Every one of those cars was attached to and detached from freight locomotives that required the same cycle of service as any other steam power on the system. The Altoona Works in 1944 employed 16,000 workers. Most of them did not operate locomotives. They kept them running. The maintenance workforce was organized by trade. Boilermakers worked the pressure vessels. Machinists worked the rotating and reciprocating machinery. Blacksmiths worked hot metal. Carmen worked the running gear. Electricians maintained the growing inventory of electrical equipment. Each trade had its apprenticeship. A young man entering the blacksmith shop might spend 4 years under a journeyman before being trusted with a full assignment. The machinists in the machine shops knew the wear patterns of specific wheel classes. The boilermakers at Juniata knew which boiler designs failed at which components first. This knowledge was not written down in any manual that covered it completely. It was carried in the people who had spent their working lives accumulating it. Trade by trade, locomotive class by locomotive class, year by year. The Pennsylvania Railroad retired its last steam locomotive in October 1957. The coal towers were decommissioned. The ash pits were filled. The fire cleaning crews were reassigned or laid off. The knowledge accumulated over generations of practice at Altoona, at Harrisburg, and at Enola did not transfer cleanly to the diesel era. Much of it simply ended. The East Altoona roundhouse was demolished. The erecting bays were retooled for diesel work, then partially closed. By the time Penn Central took over in 1968, the complex that had employed 16,000 workers in 1944 was a fraction of its former scale. What the Pennsylvania Railroad had built at Altoona was not simply a maintenance facility. It was the industrial precondition for the operation of a transcontinental railroad in the steam era. The tracks, the schedules, and the locomotive assignments were the visible surface of the system. Underneath them, in the roundhouses and the erecting bays and the boiler shops, a parallel industry ran day and night to keep the visible surface moving. The standard railroad of the world required a standard maintenance system to match, and for 100 years, it had one. If this story gave you a clearer picture of what holds these systems together and what it takes when they come under pressure, subscribe to the channel. There are more corridors, more grids, more operations, and more decisions still to document. And if you have a connection to this kind of work, a relative who spent decades in a control room, a parent who worked a rail yard or a generating station, someone who was there when a system like this was tested, tell us in the comments. What did they operate? Where did they work? What do you remember them saying about the job? The most complete record of how these systems were built and run isn't in any report. It's in the people who were actually there,